As many of you may or may not have noticed, I hadn't posted a video for a few weeks. And I wanted to make this video primarily to talk about that. Earlier this year, I'd committed to making more spiritual videos, and that's exactly what this is. Now, I did post a couple videos this past weekend, but honestly, I filmed them about a month ago. I just finally got a little bit of a chance to breathe and get a couple of videos edited, but man, I have been through such a spiritual journey over the last couple of weeks that I felt it very important to share, because I believe that regardless of who you are, your circumstances, you're either coming out of a storm, getting ready to go into one, or you're right in the middle of one. And man, God delivered in a big way through this, and I just thought it'd be good to share it, just to really encourage you if you're in the middle of a storm, or you're about to go into one, or if you're coming out of one, whatever it may be. About 2 months ago, a good friend of mine asked me and invited me to come hear him preach at a little country church. He was applying for a job as a preacher there and asked if I'd come and support him. And of course I said, heck yeah, I will. So 2 Sundays ago, I went and listened to him preach, and he started preaching on Gideon. And he mentioned, as he started to preach, all know the story of Gideon. And the first thing I thought is, actually, I don't know this story. And as he preached, there was just something in this story. And the story of Gideon is really a story of persecution of the Jews. For about 7 years, the Midianites had been persecuting the Jews for about 7 years. And during harvest time, they'd come and steal all their harvest, so most of them starved to death over the winter. As well as they'd attack them and do various atrocities towards them for about 7 years. So many Midianites that they said it was uncountable. It was like sands of the sea. So one day, Gideon is hiding all the wheat in a wine press for when they come and raid. They at least have something to make it through the winter. And God shows up. And at first, Gideon doesn't believe it's God, but once he realizes it is God, the very first thing he does is he says, let me go prepare an offering for you. And the next thing that he does is God tells him to tear down this false idol. So he does. And then everybody wants to kill him. And then again, God tells him to build essentially a thing for God, representing God, and he does. And then he prepares him for battle against the Midianites. And he has about 125,000 people with him. And as soon as they realize who they're up against, 100,000 of them flee in fear. And then the 25,000 that's remaining, God tests them. He has them go down to this brook and drink water, and depending on the way they drank water, they either passed or failed. And in the end, Gideon was left with 300 men. And these 300 men essentially pursued the enemy. The first thing that he did was, Gideon was, of course, afraid. And God, to encourage him, said, well, go down to the camp and listen what they have to say. And as he went down there, a couple of the soldiers were saying, I had a dream last night that Gideon was this giant loaf of bread, and he just rolled over the camp and crushed us all, and now we're all scared about it. So encouraged by that, Gideon then gets all his men together, and they hold torches up and blow horns as they surround him, and it just makes the enemy flee, and they just pursue him through exhaustion and continue to pursue him and continue to pursue him until all of them are defeated. So I hear this story, and the way my friend preached, it hit my life. And at the time, I was not going into a storm. Had no idea why I was listening to this, but I knew there was something to it. As the start of the school year went, I went to work early one morning by myself, and I just thought there's something in this story, so I started reading it and kind of taking notes. And what I found out was that I was kind of living through some of these things. The first thing I noticed was he gave God an offering. And as a school, we tithe to local churches. We do that because we don't bring in state funds, and we're always a little bit short. Some years we've been upwards of $100,000 short, but God always fills in those gaps. It's the only way I know for sure it'll work. But on top of that, we had a cornerstone in our building that had a false idol on it. The building was not originally built for a Christian school. It was built by a group of people in the 70s that put a false idol on the cornerstone. So I realized, okay, we're making our offering. Well, let's rip this stone out of the wall. We ripped it out, and we then pursued having a mason put a cross in the other side of it, and we're going to put it back in. So I start to see God move. The next thing I see is some families that were there before I was there, and some of them just really didn't believe God was going to fill in that gap financially for them. And the way I always kind of look at my relationship with the school and families is, if this is where the school needs to be financially to be secure, and this is where the families need to be financially secure, we're absolutely willing to go this direction to give out financial aid, fully knowing God's going to fill that gap in. But we really need families to kind of do the same, trusting that God is going to fill that gap in. And what I saw was families that didn't believe that God would fulfill that kind of fleeing, essentially saying, well, if you don't give me this really ridiculous deal, then we're going to flee. And at some point, I just had to draw the line. It's always sad seeing them leave, but I realized, wow, there's actually people fleeing in fear. I think something's happening here. So much so that I warned the staff, I go, I hate to say it, but I think you're all about to get tested. I don't even know what this looks like, but you're about to get tested. Few things happened the first week of school that led me to have to let a particular person go who happened to hold the keys to a building that we were using. He was a pastor across the street, and he held the keys to a building we were using for our high school. And I knew there was a complication there. I didn't hire him, he was there before I got there, but I always knew that's kind of a strange relationship because he kind of holds this authority over us, being that he owns the building. Well, he's the pastor of the building, and we held an authority over him because we pay him a paycheck. But I had to let him go. Firing somebody is my least favorite thing I've ever done in my life almost. So it's something that I never take lightly, but it had to be done. So the moment I let him go, he actually threatened to take the building, and I knew right then, oh, well, we definitely have to let you go. We're definitely not letting anybody hold the school hostage. So I went back, and then I realized there was actually a staff member who had been spreading terrible slander about another teacher all over town. Keep in mind, it's a small country town. Word spreads quick. I'd also warned this person 3 years ago that that's against policy. We can't, nor is it not Christian to do either. As well as we've held all sorts of in-service about just going straight up to a person if you have an issue with them. So this person, when I kind of called him on it, then quit. And then instead of giving the 2 weeks, I just asked him to leave because I needed the bleeding to stop mostly. Unfortunately, we also had her sister working in the building, and then she then came up to me and quit. Kind of the same thing, all in one day. And I realized, wow, God is really testing people. Now, I want to make an important note here. Because I saw God in this, there was no point that I had any fear at all. Normally, I'd be like, what is going on? Like, this is all falling apart around me. But I saw God in it. And I remember going home that night and talking to my wife, just saying, I'm not scared of the situation. I'm actually scared of God right now. Because I saw a God that was very different. I always kind of looked at God that he sits on this throne, and I could easily boldly enter into his throne room and fall on my knees and make requests. Sometimes I see God as a loving father, and I could just kind of give him a big hug and ask him for things, or just ask him for love or protection or guidance or wise counsel, or the kind of things that a good father gives. But the God I saw was one that was not messing around. And I realized not only is it not in my control, but I wouldn't stop it if I could. So I'm watching these things play out, and it was very intimidating to me. That was Monday. On Tuesday, myself and 2 other staff members were witnesses to a crime last year, kind of a long story. But we had to go to court. It was really a terrible offense. But we had to go to court as witnesses. Had nothing to do with school. We just had to be witnesses. Was all it was to it. But the lives of some people were held in the balance. Some innocent people that would be placed right back into a terrible situation. One of my staff members that had gone first, she went to court, and they just ripped her apart. She came out of the courtroom and looked at me and just cried and ran out of the courtroom, ran out of the building, ran down the street. And at that point, I hadn't had the chance to testify. They said they were just going to continue it until Friday. And I'm thinking, man, this is a tough way to start the week. That's just Tuesday. And what I realized was that at this point, the battle hadn't even started. Just like for Gideon, I couldn't even imagine facing this army and 100,000 people flee in fear. And then the other 25,000 fail at testing. You're just left with 300. And it's just kind of how I felt everything felt it was. So as court was continued to Friday, meanwhile, our school's starting to stabilize, and really the people that were left there, they wanted to be there. We have one of the most wonderful group of people I've ever worked with in my life, and the most wonderful parents I've ever worked for. And honestly, everybody wants to be there. Everybody loves it there. And I've never really felt that whole feeling with everybody. It's for the first time, and it's funny, only God could have done that. So Friday morning as I'm driving, I'm really nervous about court because honestly, this particular attorney that should rip my other staff member apart, I had to face as well. And I just wanted the truth to be told is really all it was. So as I'm driving to work, I was praying, and strangely, God said that He gave that. He said, just said this to me. And if you're a praying person, the longer you pray, you tend to hear your Father's voice and recognize it. And I believe this is what it was. God told me that He gave that particular attorney a dream about me, and that I crushed him, and that he woke up afraid of me. So now go in and conquer today. It was really kind of a strange thing. Friday morning, we also have chapel. So Friday morning, I went in. We just had one of the most awesome praise services. Just started the day with an hour and a half of praise and worship. And then the three of us went off to court. And honestly, that attorney would not make eye contact with me. It was really bizarre. I've never really had anybody afraid of me. I'm a pretty nice, laid-back person. So I think my guess is he was just up late working on the case and was trying to figure out how he was going to question me. And all this came out of it. And somehow he fell asleep and had this dream, and now he's scared. And the three of us just went into court, and the truth was heard. It was not only heard, it was heard loud and clear. And I believe justice will come out. I don't know what the end results will be, but in the end, the truth was told in a great and powerful way. What I didn't realize was as we were testifying, the mason was actually hammering that cornerstone into our building with a big cross on it. And since then, it's just been great joy and peace. That's why I was able to finally edit some videos this weekend. That's why I'm kind of making this video. And I'm sharing this with you because what I realized on Sunday after I got out of church is that the storm really wasn't that bad because I saw God in it. And I kind of reflect on Jesus falling asleep on the boat in the middle of the storm, and I kind of felt like that's how I felt all week. And, just realizing God is in control. And as long as you just kind of let it go and praise and worship Him, I think that's really all you got to do is just be obedient and just see Him in it. So I know it's a kind of a long, boring story. You're like, why are you telling this to me? But I just had to share it with you because honestly, had Gideon not been preached to me last Sunday, I would have been freaking out. I would have thought, where's everybody going? What do you mean I lost 3 staff members in one day? I think if I had hundreds of staff members, 3 is still a pretty big number for one day. Just to be left in perfect peace, and God just filled that place with His Holy Spirit. It was really quite beautiful. Now I want to add one more thing to this because another story that I just think really touches the heart of this story is that long time ago, it was last November, we had a cat at our school. It's just a stray cat that hangs out at school. My assistant feeds it, that's why it was always there. Sweet cat, just hung out by the front door all the time. Problem was I had around November, kids would pick it up and squeeze it and then it began to scratch them. So eventually I took this cat home, and I live about 40 miles away from work. I took the cat home. Kids loved it. Everybody loved the cat. It was an outdoor stray, so we'd let it in and out of the house. Right before Thanksgiving, we let this cat out of the house, and it never came back. Kids were sad. Everybody was sad. Even my assistant at work was really sad when I told her that it's just disappeared off the face of the earth. Right after this, the day I showed up, when all this storm was over, literally I walk up to the front door at school and this cat showed up. Last November, it had traveled through the winter, it had traveled through the spring, and it had traveled through the summer just to make it right back to that school. And I thought, what? I've heard this with dogs, but I've never heard of a cat doing this. And somebody I work with mentioned all creatures are drawn to the presence of God. And I realized, oh my God, I know that's what it was. I think that God saw I was going to go through this storm long ago, and He just prepared this just to give me, maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of think that's God showing me physical evidence of His holy presence in that place. Maybe I'm wrong, still a pretty darn cool story about a cat. So there you go. I just wanted to share this story with you again. I hope it didn't bore the tears out of you. It's just if you're going through a storm, I think if you can just stop and see God in it, because read His Word is filled with living life. It still lives today. I lived it out. I lived out Gideon. As a matter of fact, my whole staff lived out Gideon. They're all believers in what Gideon went through now as well, because they all just stared at it for 2 weeks. It was amazing. But yet, had I not known that story, I'd be freaking out in fear. But instead, the only fear I had was of God. The rest of it, it's just a storm. So I hope this video helps. If you're going through a storm, try to see God in the middle of it. And I think in the end, what you're going to find is he just shows up right in the middle of it. And if you don't know God's there, you're just going to freak out. It's going to be scary. But if you know God's there, it's a beautiful thing. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. You can also now find us at godfamilyguns.org and on Facebook and Full30, and all those links are below. If you feel called to support this channel financially, that link's also below on Patreon. But the most important part is prayer requests. Please don't ever hesitate to send that stuff in, especially if you're going through a storm in your life right now, because that's exactly what you need. You need God to step in and take over that situation. God doesn't promise us that we won't have storms in our life, but it does promise he'll be right in the middle of them all. And again, just kind of like Jesus sleeping on that boat, the rest of the disciples were freaking out thinking they're about to die, and Jesus just like, leave me alone, I'm sleeping. And that's just for the first time in my life how I kind of felt this last 2 weeks. So never hesitate to send that stuff in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, love guns.